happens once the door between the two countries is opened and there's free trade between the rich country and the developing country? Well, now the rich country doesn't have to produce rice anymore, software anymore. It can concentrate on rice and import its software from the rich country. So the developing country now produces more rice and less software than before. This means that the demand for low-skilled workers is higher than before because the low-skilled workers are very much needed for rice, not so much for software, and now the country is producing more rice, so it needs more low-skilled workers. So the low-skilled workers' wages rise, and just the opposite occurs for the high-skilled workers. They aren't much needed for rice, so if there's a shift from software to rice, their wages fall. And that is what we mean by a decrease in inequality. The low-skill wages come up, the high-skill wages come down. The gap between rich and poor is now smaller than before. And that is what advocates of globalization said would happen. That's what advocates of globalization, that's why advocates of globalization said that globalization would reduce inequality. Well, for all previous globalizations, they were right, but for this particular one, this latest one, they were wrong. And it's because they were wrong that I got interested in this topic myself. I wondered, how could a theory which had been so successful for so many years, the theory of comparative advantage, get things so wrong this time around? And Michael Kramer have been developing an alternative theory, a theory which provides not so much a completely different theory from comparative advantage, but a supplement to comparative advantage, which allows us to see why the current globalization is so different from the previous globalizations that the world has experienced. Internationalized production. So one example of the internationalization of production is provided by computers. Computers are an example of international production because computers are typically designed in one country, say the US. They're programmed someplace else, perhaps in Europe, and these days that's very often China. So computers are a great example of how production has been internationalized, but they're just one example out of many, many examples. And if we think of globalization as the internationalization of production, we can begin to understand why global markets have actually increased inequality. But let me describe. Before I was talking about high-skill and low-skill workers, but of course, in reality, there are many levels of skill. For my purposes today, I'm going to concentrate on just 4 levels, but that just to make my presentation simple. If I were doing this in its full-fledged glory, I would have a process consisting of different tasks. So in order to produce something, you need to bring together people to fulfill the different production tasks that are involved. And again, usually in production there are many tasks that have to be performed, particularly for something as complicated as computers. But for, and I suppose that that's very sensitive to the skill level. And the other I'll call the subordinate task, which is not so sensitive to the skill level. I'll focus on just two countries, one rich, one poor, or developing. The reason why the rich country is rich is because it has workers of higher skills. So let me call the skill levels of the rich country A and D. Let me call the skill level bigger than D. In this theory, output is produced by matching managers and subordinates, or bringing together the managerial task and the subordinate task, and putting of different skill levels. The amount of output you get from a particular company is going to depend. All tasks are equally sensitive to skill. Okay, so let me do the same kind of thought experiment that I did when I was talking about the theory of comparative advantage. I want to look at the production pattern and the matching pattern before globalization occurs. And here, remember, globalization means the ability to produce goods across. And I want to compare that with what happens after globalization occurs, after it becomes possible to bring together in the same company people from different countries, to match people in a poor country with people in a rich country. All right, so this is the pre-globalization pattern. In the highest level of skill, matched with the A workers who have the highest level of skill. The A workers perform the managerial task. That's very, in a rich country, we have only people living in the rich country, and in a poor country, we have only people living in the poor country. But that's before globalization. The workers in the rich country, and that in fact is the pattern that we get. It's more advantageous for the C workers to the D workers. So that the C workers all take jobs where they're matched with. Now, what effect does this have on wages? What effect does it have on inequality? Well, with people who are more highly skilled than you, that raises kids. We want to work with highly skilled people because that makes the C workers have this great new opportunity, the opportunity to work with B workers. They didn't have that before globalization. So C worker wages actually is the cause of increasing inequality. So inequality goes up as a result of globalization. That was the question I wanted to answer. We want to ask, what can we do about it? How can we, the obvious thing to do is to try to raise them so that they too have the opportunity. We can't expect themselves to make the investments because we're talking about highly unskilled people with very little. They simply can't afford to pay for their own training and education. So they're not going to be the answer. If you hire me and you give me training, you're going to train me I can go off and work for your competitor. And in that case, your investment is lost altogether. And so, although, of course, in practice, private companies do provide quite a lot of inequality. So if producers are not doing it, and workers are not doing it, we're going to have to turn to some third party to make the investment in training. And there's also a role for international organizations like the World Bank and NGOs to get into the act, the UN, foreign aid from rich countries for private foundations. You should not take away from my remarks today the lesson that globalization is a bad idea for developing countries. Actually, I would argue very strongly in countries, but in the long run, it's probably the only idea which is going to lift developing countries up and make them rich. That's how all previous rich countries got rich. So it would be a big mistake to conclude from the phenomenon of increasing inequality. We need to deal with with inequality. And I would argue that the proper response is to allow the low-skilled workers of the world, the D workers, in the theory that I've shown you, we have other economics-related questions. I'd be happy to try to address those as well. Perhaps someone can be in charge of recognizing members of the audience. I don't want to do it because...
and it is a great honor to have the opportunity to come here and listen to your presentation. My name is Day, and I just got my master from Monash University in International Development and Environmental Analysis. It is a really interesting topic to me as a student doing international development. And my question would be in globalization, mainly the topic that we are talking about today, reducing inequality. The negative impact that we are talking about today, inequality, be dealt with if we have actually used a different theory instead of the comparative advantage to explain the process of globalization. And also, the second question is dealing with the alternative theories that you are suggesting as an alternative to comparative analysis. My question in terms of that would be, given the success of comparative advantage as a theory to explain the product or the outcome of globalization, what is so special about the alternative theory that you are proposing instead of just comparing the merits in terms of ABCD? Thank you.
You asked about comparative advantage theory, some other theory. The answer to that question, I think, is the answer that applies whenever you're trying to answer a question scientifically. You use the theory which best fits the facts that you're trying to explain. The advantage theory fit the facts very well, and that's why it's become such a well-established building block of economics. But if circumstances change, globalization, the theory has to change too. And so in all cases, you want a theory which does a good job.